Hello, this is Angelica Sagath at the Osteopathy and Healing Center. So last time when we did the video, we talked about this book here called From the Dry Bone to the Living Man, about the autobiography of Dr. A.T. Still. So before we continue, I wanted to just bring out some important points that I believe are great to go over. So the first point I wanted to reiterate is that the human organism innately possesses all the agencies required for its own healing, and that was on page 5 of John Lewis's book. And Abraham Still believed that it was essential for our physical and mental development to have pure air, plain natural diet, outdoor exercise. And I'd like to add to that also about rhythms. When the body is following its own rhythms, we see that health is a result. So what do I mean by that? For example, our sleep cycle. If we follow the rhythm of our sleep cycles, then our body is healthy and is able to heal at night. Same thing with rhythms, like rhythms of eating. If we have a schedule where we eat our breakfast, lunch, dinner, that gives rhythm to the body. So I just wanted to mention there that rhythms are important, and it's important that we follow the natural cycles or rhythms of our body. The other thing I wanted to mention was, in the previous video we mentioned nature was to Dr. Still a subject to experience. And I'd say that so is osteopathy. That when patients come in, they have a hard time to explain or define what osteopathy is. Well, I'd suggest then explain your experience of it, because your experience is going to be different from every other patient. And same thing with nature. Our experience of nature may be different, but may hold some things that are the same as well. The other point, we gave 2 examples of Abraham using his intuition. And we ended off last video by saying that Dr. Still learned a fundamental lesson that was that an unimpeded supply of arterial blood has an extraordinary power to repair broken bones and heal mutilated tissue. And that was on page 39. Now, in this video, I'd like to mention some more of great points from this book, and when you read it, I'm sure that you'll get a lot out of it. So just some of the points that I like to bring out and share. So Dr. Still was at the point of his life where now he was doing preliminary experiments on the basis of nature. On the basis that nature depends for its survival upon light and heat of the sun. So he experimented, he planted corn, and he concluded that the growth must occur at night, and sunlight energy was stored during the day. He wondered if the sun rays stimulate growth of animal tissues, so to help promote wound healing, and tested hypothesis on a patient that had a badly gashed knee. That's on page 42. And while he was using a drawing knife to cut a stick, the knife slipped, driving the blade into the knee, partially severing the patellar tendon and slicing both femoral condyles. So this is what happened to Dr. Still's patient, and so he thought to himself, well, why not? Maybe we can use sunlight to stimulate the growth of the tissues. And so he cleaned the wound. Dr. Still cleaned this wound that the patient had. He exposed it to the sun, and the surface dried and it formed a gelatinous fluid. He pressed the parts together. He bandaged the knee with the leg bound straight. 10 days later, the man was able to walk. And the following year, he enlisted into the Union Army. So that's page 43. So it's interesting here how Dr. Still now is starting to experiment on his own, and in this case he was using sunlight for healing. He also continued to experiment using 2 biconvex lenses, focusing the rays to cauterize warts and other skin growths. He employed these lenses to dissolve opaque bodies such as cataract and floating specks before the eyes. It was valuable in reducing indolent ulcers and assisting cure of paralysis and rheumatism. That's on page 43. So at this point still harbored concerns about the safety of medicines. At that time they were using things like liquor, opium, and other compounds. He thought that these compounds, they added poison to a body that already was enfeebled by disease. So he questioned the eagerness that his colleagues would prescribe these medications. That's found on page 44. And he would relieve excruciating back pain that was accompanied by cholera. So at his time period, there was cholera, and so he would help to relieve that excruciating back pain by positioning his patient face down, placing a pillow under the lumbar region, and he would use his knee. He kneaded over the spine with his knees. So it's interesting because if you know a little bit about osteopathy, the practitioner uses their hands to adjust the body, and in this case, Dr. Still was using his knees to adjust the spine. So he helped to ease the pain that accompanied cholera. However, it was a short period of time that it dissipated the pain. So, but it did help the patient to urinate. So cholera is fatal, was fatal, but under Dr. Still's regime, his patients generally recovered. Now that's interesting if you start to think of, well, how about all the other diseases? How can osteopathy help other diseases? And in the book as well, it does go into other epidemics that Dr. Still lived through and what he or his colleagues did to treat patients. So, like for example, cerebral spinal meningitis came about in his lifetime. Now, at that time, the disease was known as spine brain spotted fever that was sweeping the country. Now, he had 3 kids that got cerebral spinal meningitis. And he called in his brother James, and James, he graduated with medical degree from the Rush Medical College in Chicago 2 years earlier. And if you recall in the first video, that's the same place that Abraham also graduated with his medical degree. So I want to bring this example up because I heard, or this Dr. Still's life experience I want to bring out, because I heard this in class the first day that we had a lecture, and it really makes you think about who Dr. Still is as a person and how osteopathy was shaped. So he called in his brother James, he called in another doctor, and in the book there on page 46 it says, "But medicine knew neither the cause nor the cure of disease." That's on page 46. 3 doctors gave medicines. All died. And his 13-month baby died of pneumonia days later. So as you can imagine, this was a traumatic time emotionally for Dr. Still. Then later on he found a decomposing chicken bone in the well, and he was clinging to the old theory of miasmas, and he blamed it for his loss. Now, if you recall, we introduced Abbott last time, and So here's Dr. Still going through this trauma, and again, Abbas' words come to him, but this time they have more vigor. And he lost faith in medicine. And Dr. Still realized the inefficacy of the drugs, and he blamed the loss on the gross ignorance of the medical profession. This was really a crisis that cut to the core of his doubts about Methodism. And Abraham, he prayed over the lifeless bodies, and he said to Dr. Still, it pleased God to take these little kids. So Still couldn't accept this nonsense. A God who gave life simply to destroy it so young would, he contended, be nothing short of a murderer. And that's on page 46 to 47. So here you see Dr. Still's thought process during this crisis, what he's going through. Troubling him most, though, was the statement repeated by preachers: all of God's work is perfect. So Dr. Still, he reasoned, if man, supposedly the epitome of God's work, was perfect, surely he should be capable of recovering from illness without the assistance of drugs. And if you read the book, you'll see that he continuously goes back to this statement that all of God's work is perfect. He decided then that God was not a guessing God, but a God of truth, and all his works, spiritual and material, are harmonious. His laws of animal life is absolute. So wise that God has certainly placed a remedy within the material house in which the spirit of life dwells. And that's on page 47. So again, you can see the principle here, that principle that we have our own innate ability to heal within our own bodies is coming up again. So here's a third example of intuition. So the reason I made these videos mainly is because I wanted to bring out the points in the book that talk about intuition. And the third example in the book there, it says the human body, this is Dr. Still, he intuited contains every sort of drug that the wisdom of God thought necessary for human happiness and health. This momentous insight presaged the existence of the as yet undiscovered immune system. And that's on page 47. So now it starts to make you think. Dr. Still, he intuited, yes, that we have the drugs, we have the pharmacopoeia within our bodies to heal ourselves. And it helped him in discovering what was yet not discovered, an immune system. So I want to share with you this next experience that Dr. Still had. A brother of a woman had meningitis, so she called Dr. Still over to help her brother. And Dr. Still, so he administered some whiskey, and he watched him. He watched him. Within 2 hours, he voided a full bladder, and after 2 more hours, he regained consciousness with no signs of intoxication. So by the time morning came, this man was up and out of danger. A neighbor asked Dr. Still to help her 8-year-old daughter. She was sick with brain fever. So again, they called brain fever spinal meningitis. And Dr. Still went and administered whiskey 2-3 days, and the girl fully recovered. These cases helped him not to learn about a prescription to go by, but how to philosophize as a mechanic and find the cause of death. Most significant factor, he realized later, was the spasmodic contraction of the neck muscles. Medicine appealed to factors as mental states, environment, conditions, and heredity, but Dr. Still wondered, was there yet another reason? and that's found on page 48. So you can see here that Dr. Still himself, he had 3 children he lost to spinal meningitis, and then neighbors of his came asking him for help to help their family who had spinal meningitis. So Dr. Still starts to think, starts to reason. Is there yet another reason why these patients, these people, these family have these signs and symptoms? So I just want to bring out on page 49, it says there that Dr. Still himself, he suffered from an inguinal hernia. Why? Because he carried heavy weapons and ammunition, and that injury remained lastingly troublesome for him. So on October 23rd, he engaged in the Battle of Westport. A musket ball passed through the lapels of his vest. A mine ball passed through the back of his coat, and that's found on page 49. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, well, isn't this interesting? He was in the army, however, the musket ball just passed through his lapel of his vest. The mine ball just passed through the back of his coat. That's amazing. Maybe there's some divine intervention there helping him, for him to accomplish greater purpose in life for all humanity. So April 16th, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and he settled back uneasily into his medical practice, Dr. Still. And he had a shattered faith in drugs that was compounded by 2 disturbing observations. A widespread problem among ex-soldiers of alcoholism and addiction to substances, initially taken as medicines. And during the war, a perceptibly lower incidence of infant mortality in the parts of Kansas and Missouri lacking doctors due to Army conscription. And that's found on page 51. So Dr. Still started to test the safety and the efficacy. He conducted a private survey of drugs, noting drugs he prescribed and how patients fared. The results were dismal. His conclusion on page 51, you will read, was dissatisfaction to the degree of disgust. His conscience told him to stop administering medicines altogether, but in practice this was different. Patients expected drugs. He continued to prescribe those he considered least dangerous, and that's found on page 51. So as you can see here, Dr. Still's life story is beginning to be developed. We can see what he went through and how that was instrumental in then his future. So I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you for the next video. Bye-bye.